fact, one colleague we worked with at our first jobs out of college called Tao Sunshine for that bright and cheery disposition. Even at a young age, Tao had a way with people. She was born Nguyen Thanh Tao in what was then South Vietnam. She was the fifth of 9 siblings. Her mother was a homemaker and her father an entrepreneur. And whenever he wanted to extend an invitation to relatives or business associates, he would send little Tao to deliver that invitation because even then, no one could resist her charms. Tao was just a child when the American involvement in Vietnam escalated. When the fighting came near her village, Go Yo, in the Thanh Ninh province, she and her family were forced to evacuate and stay with relatives in the countryside till it was safe to return. She always remembered the foreboding sound of artillery in the distance while the battle raged, a sound that is fortunately unknown to most of us. During this time, Tao and her family were most concerned for the safety of her eldest brother. He was an officer in the South Vietnamese military leading troops in combat. Tao had fond memories of when he would come home on leave and bring gifts to the family, including cans of Spam, but more on that later. The last knowledge Tao's family had of their firstborn was his appearance on his unit's roll call in Saigon on April 29th, 1975. The next day, the capital of their country fell, and they never heard from him again. After the war, it became all too obvious that anyone in any way associated with the defeated regime was to be denied all opportunities by the vindictive communists. It was these harsh realities that led to the Vietnamese boat lift. In Tao's village, the face of the party turned out to be none other than her father's best friend, the family doctor, who had secretly been working for the enemy throughout the war. And the new party boss had no sympathy for his old friend. With her father's business prospects ruined, her family fell on hard times. They wanted to leave the country, but could not afford to get everyone out at the same time. So they arranged for her older brother Wang to be smuggled to Thailand in 1978. The next year, after he was sponsored to America by a foster family, they decided to fund the escapes of her sisters Nhung and Ben, who's with us tonight. Clever, charming Tao, who'd been apprenticed to a tailor when she was younger, was to stay in Vietnam to help her family make ends meet. But this is where Tao demonstrated the unshakable resolve that enabled her to overcome so much adversity in her life. She was so determined to accompany her sisters that she went on a hunger strike for days. Only after her parents relented and agreed to let her go with her sisters did food pass her lips. And so one day, this plucky girl of 14 bid her parents, the rest of her family, and the only home she had ever known goodbye, possibly forever. It was the last time she would see her father. She and her 2 sisters took a bus to a village down in the Delta, nervously awaiting the dark of night in the secret cellar of a house near the river. After darkness, they were concealed with other escapees below decks in the bilge of one of the many small boats which ply the mighty Mekong and its tributaries, selling produce, hauling cargo, or catching fish. There they remained, crammed like sardines, until the boat made its way to the bay to rendezvous with a small fishing trawler, overcrowded with its human contraband. As the trawler steamed into the Gulf of Thailand towards freedom, their motor quit and they drifted for days, running out of food. Then they were attacked by pirates who preyed on refugees, stealing everything they had, and often raping the women before murdering all souls on board. But fate dealt Tao and her sisters a kinder hand. A Thai fishing boat spotted them in their plight and fought off the pirates. They offered to tow the trawler to Thai waters, and they gave each of the refugees a much-needed bowl of rice. Hours later, Tao and her shipmates awoke, realizing the rice they'd been given was drugged. While they were unconscious, their supposed rescuers deprived them of all their valuables. But at least they'd made good on their promise to tow the boat to Thai waters, as they were soon approached by a Thai patrol boat, which took them to the Songkhla refugee camp on the coast. Tao and her sisters were also fortunate to not lose all their valuables, as their mother had the foresight to sew gold chains into the hems of their dresses. A scrap of her dress with the chain still inside became Tao's most valued keepsake, a reminder from where she'd come and what she'd endure. Tao and her sisters would spend the next year of their lives in the refugee camp waiting to be sponsored to the United States. Despite an idyllic beachfront location, life in the camps was not easy. Tao had never learned to swim and nearly drowned playing in the water with friends. Once, a camp guard snuck into the sleeping quarters of Tao and her sisters one night with bad intent and was foiled by sharp-eared Tao awakening in time to spot him and call out a warning to her sisters. The donated food they were given was never quite enough to fill anyone's bellies. So Tao and her sisters pooled their meager resources to buy sacks of mung beans and other ingredients to cook a well-loved Vietnamese dessert, which they sold to their fellow refugees to make enough extra money to get additional provisions from the black marketeers who did business at the camp fence. Finally, Tao and her sisters got sponsored, and by the same family that had sponsored her brother a year before. But it was to be a short-lived reunion as the situation did not work out. Tao and her siblings were broken up. Vung was sent to a group home, and Tao and her sister Nhung to another foster home. It would be years later until Tao and her siblings were reunited in college. Tao and her brother both pursued degrees at Brooklyn Polytechnic, with Tao sharing her sister Vung's dorm room at nearby Long Island University. During that time, the rest of Tao's family tried to leave Vietnam. But by then, the government had caught wind of the earlier escapes, and her family was being watched. They were arrested and interred for months in a re-education camp. The government seized the family home her father had designed and built with his own two hands. When they got out of the camps, they used money sent by Tao and her siblings earned on part-time jobs to buy a parcel of land to build a new home in what was then a poor outlying district of Saigon, now called Ho Chi Minh City. But Tao's father was determined to get the original family home back and applied to the government for its return. He would not live to see that dream realized. It was only after his death that the national government approved the family's petition. But the local government would not relinquish possession until her mother, half blind from cataracts and half paralyzed from a stroke, a younger sister debilitated by a childhood illness, and a younger brother with Down syndrome, camped out on the front porch for 6 months. Even the Vietnamese press could not ignore such a human interest story. A newspaper article finally embarrassed the local government into vacating the premises. And the family got its original home back on September 30th, 1995, the day Tao and I were married. Despite knowing barely any English when arriving in the United States and having only 3 years of high school here, Tao pursued and attained her bachelor's degree. During college, one of her internships marked the first time she worked for Raytheon in one of its Massachusetts locations. After college, she landed a job with a defense contractor in Binghamton, New York, where I also got my first job out of school. I met Tao for the first time, or so we both thought, in the fall of 1990 when we were working on the same project. Despite our different backgrounds and cultures, I felt immediately at ease with Tao. She was somewhat shy at the time, being less than comfortable with the English language, but she was also a good listener and interesting to talk with when she drew her out. And she was so beautiful and graceful, I was smitten. Coworkers caught onto it and started egging me on to ask her out, but I couldn't summon the courage. Tao had been driving 90 minutes each way to Syracuse University after work a couple of nights each week to take programming classes, because despite her double E degree, she had been assigned primarily software tasks. On one such winter night, a huge buck jumped out onto the highway and caved in her car's doors with its front hooves. Dazed and bloodied, it got up and wandered shakily off the road. Tao needed a lift to and from work for a few days while her car was being repaired. I was only too happy to help. When I met her at the car dealer to pick her up that first morning, she gave me a heartwarming smile. We had a lot of wonderful conversations during our commute that week. On the ride back to the dealer from work at the end of the week, she asked me what I was doing for the weekend, and even I wasn't too dense to realize that was my chance, so I finally asked her out. Our first date was January 26, 1991, over 26 years ago. We had a nice dinner and went downtown to some dance clubs. It was a bitter cold evening and starting to snow. I remember that Tao's coat was a bit light for the conditions, and I threw one side of my warm overcoat around her and we walked arm in arm to try and stay warm. The dance clubs were empty that evening. Even hardy upstate New Yorkers were loath to venture out in the weather. Tao and I ended up in a jazz bar, holding hands across the table, gazing into each other's eyes, talking late into the night while enjoying the music. Even now, my heart skips a beat thinking of that magical evening. In that next month, we went out several more times. We saw our first movie together, the original Beauty and the Beast. And I think we all know which characters she was and I was. My first few years on the job, I craved business travel that had few opportunities. Of course, once I started going with Tao and no longer wanted to travel, I got shipped off to my firm's Silicon Valley location for several months. I was learning guitar at the time, so I took it with me. I serenaded Tao during one of our evening phone calls. I'd been teaching her chess before I left, so we started a game by email and sent moves to each other every day. We wrote each other letters and sent each other photos, and we made the long-distance relationship work. She flew out to visit me while I was there, and we walked down the twists and turns of San Francisco's Lombard Street together, rode the cable cars, sampled Jardelli chocolates, and took a tour boat around the bay under a fog-enshrouded Golden Gate Bridge. We visited windswept beaches, Japanese gardens, redwood forests, and Napa wineries. At one of those, I bought a magnum of champagne to save for a special occasion, which turned out to be our wedding 4 years later. I think it was during that trip when she was catching me up on news about friends and coworkers that we discovered we'd actually met each other